25 years ago, in the early 80s, when the privatization movement globally really got underway during the Reagan administration, but really pushed by the IMF and the World Bank under what they called structural adjustment programs in the developing countries, and the idea that there's too much government and government is inefficient, and really if you want your country to be stable, that it's better to privatize these public enterprises. Now, this proceeded through the 80s, but as the Cold War ended, it expanded into the military area, and what used to be called mercenaries in the old days became private military contractors. What you had was downsizing of the military as the Cold War ended, and a lot of unemployment as a result, and people moving from the public sector into the private sector. Generals, ex-officers, Navy SEALs, Rangers, looking for work, looking for the next battlefield, and having a lot of skills to bring to bear. And so they moved into these private military companies, PMCs, or private military contractors, and began to get contracts in various parts of the world to provide security, logistical support, not always on the battlefield, training, backup, but sometimes, yes, directly on the battlefield as well. And you began to see this in Africa very early, in Haiti, and then as the 90s proceeded further in Europe as well, particularly in Kosovo and Macedonia and Yugoslavia generally.
So what you're describing sounds like a global trade in hired military service.
That's exactly what it is. The U.S. was involved relatively early, but it didn't emerge as a leader right away. You had British and actually South African companies were the first to emerge, Africa being a focus. They tend to morph. Exposure is a big problem. Once you know this is going on and domestic discontent rises, then the company has trouble continuing to operate as it did. And so you had one called Executive Outcomes, which no longer exists, which was very active in Africa in the early to mid-90s. And they would receive contracts from a company to basically help them fight an insurgency. And so they get these specialized warriors in there to help them counter the insurgency. Unfortunately, that leads the insurgents to hire mercenaries to fight the contractors who are fighting them. And so it, in a sense, leads to an escalation of arms proliferation, and it may stabilize a country in the short term, but lead to problems later. Now we have some leading U.S. companies who have emerged. Military Professional Resources Incorporated. It just sounds so innocuous and helpful. Their leaders have impeccable credentials, not only in the military area, but also out of government in high technology, as I think we're going to talk about. And DynCorp, probably the largest military contractor now in terms of at least at the scope of its activities throughout the world. And so it's related to the general idea of privatization, that private is more efficient. These companies are not accountable to Congress. They're licensed by the State Department or by the Pentagon, but they don't report to the U.S. government officially. The money goes through intermediaries. The money goes to a foreign country, to a private military contractor.